My name is Joaquin Rivera, and I'm a professional storyteller who survived the first 24 hours of the zombie outbreak. When the water supply got contaminated in Albuquerque, I was reading stories to children at the public library. Within minutes, our librarian turned into something hungry and violent. I had to protect 7 kids while learning that my grandmother's old folklore contained the survival secrets we desperately needed. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Joaquin Rivera, and I need to tell you exactly what happened during those first 24 hours when everything we knew about the world ended. I'm a professional storyteller, which probably sounds useless in an apocalypse, but I promise you it's the reason 6 children, and I made it through that first day alive. Before July 15th, 2025, I spent my life traveling across the Southwest, collecting stories from elderly community members, performing at libraries and schools, preserving the oral traditions that were disappearing with each generation that passed. My grandmother, Elena Rivera, raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 16. She was a curandera, a traditional healer, but more than that, she was a keeper of stories. She used to tell me that stories weren't just entertainment or history lessons. They were survival manuals written in metaphor, passed down through generations, because they contained wisdom that could keep people alive when everything else failed. I thought she was being poetic. I was wrong. That Tuesday morning started like any other. I woke up in my small apartment near Old Town Albuquerque, made coffee, and reviewed my notes for the afternoon reading session at the main public library. I was planning to tell the children the story of La Llorona, the weeping woman who searches eternally for her lost children. The irony of that choice still haunts me. I had been working on a collection of stories from local elders about historical plagues and disasters, interviewing people in their 80s and 90s who remembered their grandparents talking about the influenza pandemic of 1918, the Dust Bowl, times when communities had to come together or die apart. One woman, Mrs. Adelina Sandoval, had told me just the week before about her great-grandmother's stories of agua enferma, sick water that turned people into something that wasn't quite human anymore. She said her ancestors spoke of times when wells would be poisoned by evil spirits, and whole villages would have to flee to the mountains until the contamination passed. I filed it away as folklore, another colorful tale for my collection. I should have listened more carefully. I arrived at the library around noon to set up for the 2:30 children's program. The Albuquerque Public Library's main branch was a beautiful building, all glass and modern architecture, but I always preferred the cozy children's section with its reading nooks and colorful displays. Mrs. Henderson, the head librarian, was a woman in her early 60s who had been working there for over 20 years. She knew every regular patron by name and had this wonderful way of matching people with exactly the books they needed, even when they didn't know what they were looking for. When I stopped by the water fountain near the children's section to fill my bottle, the water tasted different. Metallic, almost bitter, with an aftertaste that reminded me of old pennies. I mentioned it to Mrs. Henderson, but she just shrugged and said the city had been doing maintenance on the water lines all week. She suggested I grab a bottle from the staff refrigerator instead, which I did, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My grandmother always said to trust your instincts about food and water, that our bodies knew things our minds hadn't figured out yet. The children started arriving around 2 o'clock. There were 7 of them that day, which was actually a smaller group than usual for summer programming. Maria Gutierrez, a shy 7-year-old whose mother brought her every week. Tommy Chen, 9 years old and always full of questions about the stories I told. Sarah Williams, 8, who loved scary stories and wasn't afraid of anything. Jake Rodriguez, 6, who usually sat right up front and hung on every word. David Kim, 7, quiet but thoughtful, always asked the most insightful questions afterward. Emma Johnson, 8, who had just moved to Albuquerque and was still making friends, and Luis Morales, 9, who spoke both English and Spanish, and often helped me with pronunciation when I included Spanish phrases in my stories. I had arranged the reading circle with colorful cushions on the carpet, my guitar case open beside me in case I wanted to add some music to the storytelling. The children settled in, chattering excitedly about what story I might tell them today. I always started with the same ritual, something my grandmother had taught me. I would ask them to close their eyes and listen to the silence for just a moment, to prepare their minds for the story that was coming. It helped them focus and created a sense of ceremony around the experience. But before I could begin, Mrs. Henderson walked into the children's section. At first, I thought she was just checking on us, making sure everything was ready for the program. But something was wrong with the way she moved. Her usual graceful stride had become jerky, uncoordinated, like she was fighting against her own body with every step. Her face was pale, almost gray, and there was something vacant about her eyes that made my skin crawl. The children noticed too. Little Maria scooted closer to me, and Tommy stopped mid-sentence in whatever story he had been telling Jake about his morning. The silence stretched out uncomfortably as Mrs. Henderson stood there swaying slightly, her mouth hanging open just a bit, making this soft clicking sound with her tongue. I stood up slowly, keeping my voice calm and gentle. "Mrs. Henderson, are you feeling all right? Do you need to sit down?" I had seen people have medical emergencies before, strokes or diabetic episodes that could cause confusion and disorientation. My first thought was to get the children out of the way and call for medical help. But when she turned toward the sound of my voice, I saw that her eyes weren't just vacant. They were hungry, predatory, like she was looking at me and seeing something she wanted to consume. The clicking sound got louder, and I realized she was actually grinding her teeth together. There was dried blood around her fingernails, and her shirt had what looked like bite marks torn in the fabric. My grandmother had told me stories about people who got lost in the desert and came back wrong, their minds taken by spirits that fed on human flesh. She called them hambrientos, the hungry ones, and said you could recognize them by their eyes. They looked at people the way coyotes looked at rabbits. I had always assumed those were just cautionary tales about the dangers of wandering too far from home. I was wrong about that too. Mrs. Henderson made this sound, this low moaning that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest, and then she moved. I had never seen a 60-year-old woman move that fast. She lunged toward our reading circle with her arms outstretched, her fingers hooked like claws, knocking over a display of picture books as she came straight for me. I grabbed my guitar case by the handle and swung it as hard as I could, catching her in the shoulder and sending her stumbling backward into the biography section. The children were screaming now, scrambling to get away from her, but she was already getting back up, and this time she wasn't looking at me. She was looking at little Maria, who had frozen in terror instead of running. That's when I saw them through the library's front windows. People stumbling down Central Avenue, their movements jerky and unnatural, chasing other people who were running and screaming. A man in a business suit tackled a woman right in front of the bus stop, and I could see him biting her neck while she fought to get away. A teenager was pounding on car windows, leaving bloody handprints on the glass, while the driver inside honked frantically and tried to get away. Whatever was happening to Mrs. Henderson was happening everywhere. I scooped up Maria and shouted for the other children to follow me toward the back of the library. "Stay together. Stay close to me." My voice came out steadier than I felt, which was good because these kids needed someone who sounded like he knew what he was doing, even if I had no idea what was happening or how to handle it. But Mrs. Henderson wasn't the only one. 3 more adults had wandered into the library through the main entrance, all of them moving with that same predatory shuffle, their clothes torn and stained with blood. One was Mr. Patterson, a regular patron who usually spent his afternoons reading newspapers in the periodicals section. Another was a woman I didn't recognize, but she was wearing a grocery store uniform and had what looked like bite marks all over her arms. We made it to the staff break room in the back of the building, and I slammed the door behind us, turning the deadbolt with shaking hands. The room was small, just big enough for a few chairs, a microwave and a small refrigerator, but it had solid walls and only one door. Through the thin walls, I could hear chaos erupting throughout the library. Screaming, crashing sounds, that terrible moaning noise multiplying as more of those things showed up. The children huddled together on the floor, looking at me with wide, terrified eyes. Maria was crying silently, tears streaming down her face. Tommy kept asking what was wrong with Mrs. Henderson, why her eyes looked like that. I didn't have answers for any of them, but I knew I had to say something. "Listen to me," I said, kneeling down so I was at their eye level. "Something is making people sick, making them act strange and dangerous. But we're safe in here for now, and I'm going to figure out how to get us out of this building and somewhere safer. I need all of you to be brave, like the heroes in the stories I tell you." I pulled out my phone to call 911, but the line was busy. I tried again, still busy. I tried calling my neighbor, my cousin, even the library's main number. Nothing was getting through. The local news app on my phone was starting to load, and I could see a breaking news banner across the top. "Water contamination emergency. Avoid all tap water, shelter in place. National Guard activated." Water contamination. The metallic taste from the fountain earlier suddenly made horrible sense. I thought about Mrs. Henderson suggesting I drink from the staff refrigerator instead, and my stomach dropped. How much of that water had I actually consumed before I noticed the taste? How long did whatever this was take to affect people? Emma looked up at me with those serious 8-year-old eyes and asked, "Mr. Rivera, are we going to die?" The question hit me like a physical blow, because I realized that yes, we very well might die, and these children were looking to me to prevent that from happening. Outside the break room door, something heavy slammed against the wood. Once. Twice. I could hear scratching sounds like fingernails or claws dragging across the surface. The door was solid, but it wasn't meant to withstand a sustained assault. The frame was already starting to creak under the pressure. My grandmother had always told me that when the world becomes dangerous, the storyteller has two jobs. First, keep people's spirits alive with hope and purpose. Second, remember the old wisdom hidden in the stories, because folklore exists for a reason. She used to say that every traditional tale contained at least one piece of practical survival advice, disguised as entertainment, so it would be passed down reliably through generations. I started thinking about the stories I knew that might help us. The tale of the quiet rabbit, who escaped from predators by moving silently and using misdirection. The legend of the clever crow, who survived by observing his enemies' patterns and exploiting their weaknesses. The story of the protective bear, who would fight to the death to defend cubs that weren't even his own. "I'm going to tell you a very important story," I said to the children, keeping my voice low and calm. "It's about a rabbit who found herself trapped in a cave with a hungry coyote blocking the only exit. The rabbit was small and couldn't fight the coyote, but she was smart and she was quiet, and she remembered something her grandmother had taught her about finding hidden paths." As I spoke, I was also thinking practically. The break room had a small window that looked out onto the loading dock area behind the library. It was narrow, but the children might be able to fit through it. I could see a delivery truck parked back there, which meant there had to be a way to get from the loading dock to the street. The question was whether we could make it that far without running into more of those things. The scratching at the door was getting more intense, and now I could hear multiple voices making that awful moaning sound. They were gathering outside, drawn by the sounds we had made getting into the room. In the rabbit story, the clever rabbit waited until the coyote was distracted by something else before making her move. Maybe we needed to create our own distraction. In this story, I continued, the rabbit remembered that coyotes have very good hearing, but they get confused when they hear sounds coming from different directions at the same time. So she found a way to make noise in one part of the cave while she escaped through another part. Tommy was catching on. He was a smart kid, and he could see that this wasn't just a story. How did she make the noise, Mr. Rivera? I smiled at him, grateful that at least one of the children was thinking strategically instead of just being scared. She used her voice, Tommy. She made the coyote think she was in a different place than where she really was. The window was definitely our best option. I could boost the children up one at a time, then squeeze through myself. But first, I needed to draw those things away from the door. My phone had a voice recording app, and the break room had a small Bluetooth speaker that the staff used for background music during their breaks. I quickly recorded myself talking loudly, saying things like, "We're over here, help us. Can anyone hear us?" Then I connected my phone to the speaker and set it on the far side of the room from the window. When I played the recording, it would sound like we were still in that corner of the room, hopefully drawing the infected away from the door and giving us a chance to escape through the window. "Remember the rabbit story," I whispered to the children as I started working on opening the window latch. "We're going to be very quiet, and we're going to move very carefully, and we're going to help each other get to safety." The window opened with a soft click, and I could feel cooler air coming in from outside. The loading dock was about 4 feet below the window, an easy drop for me but potentially dangerous for the smaller children. I would have to lower them down one at a time. Maria went first, because she was the smallest and the most scared, and I wanted to get her to safety as quickly as possible. I lifted her up to the window and helped her climb through, then lowered her down by her hands until she was hanging just a foot or so above the concrete loading dock before letting her drop. She landed safely and immediately looked back up at me, waiting for instructions. "Hide behind that truck," I whispered. "Stay very quiet until we're all down there with you." The door was starting to splinter. Long cracks were appearing in the wood, and I could see fingers trying to work their way through the gaps. It was time to use our distraction. I activated the recording and turned the speaker volume up as high as it would go. The sound of my own voice filled the room, and immediately the scratching and pounding at the door intensified. They were taking the bait. David went through the window next, then Emma, then Jake. Each time I had to lift them carefully, help them through the narrow opening, and lower them down to the loading dock. Lewis was bigger than the others but still manageable. That left Tommy, who had been helping me keep the other children calm while we worked. Just as I was lifting Tommy up to the window, the door gave way. The frame splintered completely, and 3 of those things stumbled into the room, their eyes immediately drawn to the speaker where my recorded voice was still playing. Mrs. Henderson was one of them, her gray hair disheveled, and her library name tag hanging by one corner. They moved toward the sound with that jerky, predatory gait, giving us just enough time to get Tommy through the window and for me to squeeze through after him. I dropped down onto the loading dock just as one of them realized the trick and turned toward the window. Its face appeared in the opening just as I was helping the children move away from the building, and the look of rage and hunger in its eyes told me that whatever these things were, they weren't just sick people. They had become something else entirely, something that saw us as prey. The loading dock opened onto an alley that ran behind the library, connecting to the street on both sides. I could hear chaos from both directions, screaming and car horns, and that awful moaning sound echoing off the buildings. We needed to find shelter somewhere safer than an alley, but first we needed to figure out which direction to go. My grandmother used to tell me that when you're lost and in danger, the first thing you do is get to high ground so you can see the whole situation. The Sandia Mountains were visible to the east, and there were some hills on the west side of the city that had radio towers and cell phone repeaters. If we could get to higher elevation, we might be able to see how widespread this outbreak was and figure out where to go for help. But first, we needed to get out of this alley without attracting attention. I gathered the 7 children around me, making sure I could see all of their faces. They were scared, but they were listening, which was more than I had any right to hope for under the circumstances. "We're going to move like the quiet rabbit," I told them, remembering my grandmother's stories about being invisible when predators were hunting. "Small steps, no talking, stay close together. If you see any grown-ups who look like Mrs. Henderson did, don't run toward them asking for help. Run away from them and stay with me." Little Maria took my hand, and the other children clustered around us as we started moving toward the western end of the alley. I could see the street from here, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There were dozens of those things wandering around, some in small groups, others alone, all of them moving with that same unnatural gait. Cars were abandoned in the middle of the road, some with their doors hanging open, others crashed into storefronts or wrapped around telephone poles. But the most disturbing thing was how organized they seemed. These weren't just random sick people stumbling around in confusion. They were hunting, working together, communicating with each other through those moaning sounds. When one of them spotted a living person, the others would converge on the location. It was almost like watching a pack of wolves, except wolves were predictable. These things were something new. As we reached the end of the alley, I realized that our escape from the library was just the beginning. We were 6 children and 1 storyteller, alone in a city that had become a hunting ground, and the sun was starting to get lower in the sky. In a few hours, it would be dark, and I had a feeling that these creatures would be even more dangerous after sunset. I thought about my grandmother's stories again, looking for wisdom that might keep us alive. She had always said that the most important part of any story was not the beginning or the middle, but the transition between scenes. The moment when the hero realizes that the world has changed forever, and they have to choose between the person they used to be and the person they need to become to survive. Standing there in that alley, watching a city full of monsters while 7 terrified children looked to me for answers I didn't have, I understood that this was my transition moment. I was no longer Joaquin Rivera, the traveling storyteller who entertained children with folklore and preserved cultural traditions for posterity. I was now the only thing standing between these kids and whatever nightmare the world had become. The question was whether the stories my grandmother had filled my head with contained enough practical wisdom to keep us alive until help arrived. Because looking at the chaos spreading through the streets of Albuquerque, I was starting to suspect that help might be a long time coming, and we were going to have to figure out how to survive on our own. The street beyond the alley was like something out of a nightmare, but we couldn't stay hidden forever. I kept the children close as we moved along the sidewalk, staying near buildings so we could duck into doorways if we needed to hide. The creatures, and I had started thinking of them as creatures rather than people, seemed to be drawn to movement and sound, but they didn't appear to have enhanced vision. If we stayed quiet and moved carefully, we might be able to avoid their attention. My grandmother had told me stories about Coyote, the trickster figure from Navajo tradition, and how he survived by understanding his enemies better than they understood themselves. She said Coyote would watch predators for hours, learning their hunting patterns, their weaknesses, the times when they were most and least dangerous. Right now, I was Coyote, and these children were depending on me to figure out how these things operated. As we moved through the residential neighborhood west of the library, I started noticing patterns. The creatures moved in loose groups of 3 to 5, but they weren't coordinated like a military unit. They were more like a pack of wild dogs, following scent trails and reacting to each other's behavior. When one of them caught sight or sound of potential prey, it would make that moaning sound, and the others would converge on the location. But they seemed to lose interest quickly if the target disappeared, moving on to investigate other areas rather than conducting a systematic search. More importantly, they appeared to be slower and less focused during daylight hours. I had watched several of them through windows as we passed abandoned houses, and most seemed to be in a kind of dormant state, swaying in place or moving very slowly until something stimulated them into action. My grandmother's stories about nocturnal spirits came back to me, creatures that became more powerful and dangerous as the sun went down. I was starting to worry about what these things might become after dark. We found temporary shelter in an abandoned food truck parked behind a strip mall. The truck's engine was still running, keys in the ignition, but there was blood splattered across the service window and the driver's door was hanging open. Whoever had been operating it had left in a hurry, probably when the outbreak started affecting their customers. The important thing was that it provided us with an enclosed space where we could rest and plan our next move. The children crowded into the small food prep area while I checked the truck's supplies. There were bottles of water, bags of chips, some canned goods, and a first aid kit. More importantly, there was a battery-powered radio that might give us information about what was happening in the rest of the city. I tuned it to the local emergency broadcast station, and what I heard made my heart sink. The announcer's voice was strained, barely controlled panic bleeding through his professional delivery. The water contamination wasn't limited to Albuquerque. Reports were coming in from Santa Fe, Las Cruces, El Paso, Phoenix, Tucson, everywhere that shared water resources with the Rio Grande watershed system. The National Guard had been activated, but communication with many units had been lost. Citizens were advised to shelter in place, avoid all tap water, and under no circumstances approach anyone showing signs of the infection. Signs of infection. That was the first time I had heard it described in medical terms, and somehow that made it more real and more terrifying. This wasn't some supernatural curse or spiritual contamination. This was a biological agent, something that could be studied and potentially treated, but also something that was spreading faster than the authorities could contain it. Tommy had been listening to the radio broadcast, and he looked up at me with those serious 9-year-old eyes. "Mr. Rivera, if the water made people sick, and we all drank water today, are we going to turn into those things too?" It was the question I had been dreading because I didn't have a good answer. I had tasted the contaminated water at the library, but I had only taken a small sip before noticing something was wrong. The children had been drinking from their own water bottles that they brought from home, so they might not have been exposed at all. But I couldn't be certain, and the not knowing was almost worse than if we had definitive bad news. "I don't think so," I told him, trying to project more confidence than I felt. "We didn't drink very much of the bad water, and our bodies are strong. But we need to pay attention to how we feel, and if anyone starts feeling sick or strange, they need to tell me right away." What I didn't tell him was that I had been monitoring myself for symptoms ever since we left the library. Any unusual thoughts, changes in perception, increases in aggression or hunger. So far, I felt normal, just scared and responsible for 7 young lives in an impossible situation. But I made a mental note to keep checking, because if I started to turn into one of those things, I needed to get away from the children before I became a danger to them. David, the quiet 7-year-old, had been sitting by himself near the back of the truck, and when I looked over at him, I noticed he was holding his left arm strangely. "David, are you hurt?" I asked, moving over to examine him more closely. He had scratches on his forearm, 3 parallel lines that looked like they could have come from fingernails. They weren't deep, barely breaking the skin, but there was a small amount of blood, and the area around them was starting to look inflamed. "It happened when we were climbing out of the library window," he said quietly. "I think I scraped it on the metal frame." I wanted to believe that, but the scratches looked too deliberate, too evenly spaced. They looked like claw marks. I thought back to our escape, trying to remember if any of the creatures had gotten close enough to David to scratch him. Mrs. Henderson had been reaching through the window just as we were getting away. It was possible that she had managed to make contact. I cleaned the scratches with water from one of the bottles and applied antiseptic from the first aid kit, but I found myself watching David more carefully after that. The radio broadcast hadn't said anything specific about how long the incubation period was, how the infection was transmitted, or what the early symptoms looked like. I was flying blind, making medical decisions based on folklore and intuition. My grandmother had told me stories about shapeshifters, people who could transform into animals or monsters, and she always said the same thing about them. The change started small, barely noticeable differences in behavior or appetite, but it accelerated quickly once it began. She said the key was recognizing the signs early, before the transformation became irreversible. I decided we needed to keep moving. The food truck was a good temporary shelter, but it was also a trap if we got surrounded. The radio had mentioned that the National Guard was setting up refugee camps in the foothills east of the city, near the base of the Sandia Mountains. If we could make it there, we might find medical help for David and safety for all of us. But first, we had to cross most of Albuquerque, probably after dark, while avoiding an unknown number of infected people who were becoming more dangerous by the hour. It seemed impossible, but my grandmother had always said that impossible things became possible when you broke them down into smaller, manageable steps. "We're going to play a traveling game," I told the children, gathering them around me in the cramped space of the food truck. "It's based on an old story about a family of mice who had to cross a field full of owls and foxes to reach a safe place where there was plenty of food and warm nests for winter." The children looked skeptical. They were smart enough to know this wasn't really a game, but they were also young enough to respond to the familiar structure of storytelling, the sense that if this was a story, it might have a happy ending. The mice succeeded because they followed three rules. First, they traveled in single file, with the smallest mouse in the middle where she was most protected. Second, they stopped frequently to listen and watch, making sure they knew where all the predators were before moving to the next safe spot. Third, they helped each other, with the older mice taking responsibility for the younger ones, and everyone watching out for everyone else. As I spoke, I was also thinking practically about our route. The main roads would be too dangerous, full of abandoned cars and probably crawling with infected people. But Albuquerque had an extensive network of irrigation ditches, acequias, that ran throughout the city. Many of them were concrete-lined channels that would provide cover from observation, while allowing us to move relatively quickly toward our destination. The sun was getting lower, maybe 3 hours until full darkness. We needed to start moving soon if we wanted to make significant progress while we could still see clearly. I divided up the supplies from the food truck, giving each child a small backpack with water and snacks, keeping the first aid kit and radio with me. "Remember the mouse story," I said as we prepared to leave our temporary shelter. "Single file, frequent stops help each other, and if you see any of the sick people, don't try to help them or talk to them. They're not themselves anymore, and they can't be reasoned with or cured by being kind to them." We left the food truck and made our way toward the nearest acequia. The concrete channel was about 4 feet deep and 3 feet wide, just enough space for us to walk single file while staying below street level. It would take us roughly in the direction we wanted to go, and most importantly, it would keep us hidden from casual observation. Maria went first because she was the smallest and most frightened, and I wanted her where I could see her easily. Then Emma, Jake, Louis, David, and Tommy, with me bringing up the rear. It wasn't ideal having David so far from me when I was worried about his scratches, but Tommy was mature enough to watch him and alert me if anything seemed wrong. The acequia system worked better than I had hoped. We were able to move steadily westward, staying hidden while making good time. Occasionally, we would hear moaning sounds from the streets above us, or catch glimpses of infected people wandering through neighborhoods, but we remained undetected. The children were being incredibly brave, following my instructions without complaint, stopping when I signaled for quiet, moving when I indicated it was safe. But as the sun continued to set, I started noticing changes in the behavior of the creatures we could observe. They were becoming more active, more focused, more coordinated in their movements. Groups that had been wandering aimlessly during the day were now moving with apparent purpose, following what looked like planned routes through residential areas. My grandmother's warnings about nocturnal spirits were proving uncomfortably accurate. Whatever biological agent was causing this transformation, it seemed to operate on some kind of circadian rhythm, making the infected more dangerous as darkness approached. We had been traveling for about 2 hours when we encountered our first real obstacle. The acequia we had been following disappeared under a major intersection, and we had to surface to street level to find where it continued on the other side. The intersection was clogged with abandoned vehicles, but more concerning was the group of infected people who seemed to be congregating in the area. There were at least 15 of them, more than we had seen in one place before, and they were exhibiting new behaviors that made my blood run cold. They were communicating with each other through a series of grunts and moans that seemed almost like a primitive language. They were working together to investigate hiding places, checking inside cars, looking behind dumpsters, searching in a methodical pattern that suggested they understood the concept of a coordinated hunt. "Stay down," I whispered to the children, keeping them hidden in the concrete channel while I observed the creatures above. "Don't move, don't make any sound. I need to figure out how to get us around them." But as I watched, I realized that going around might not be an option. The group of infected was spreading out, covering more territory, and several of them were moving in our direction. It was almost like they knew we were in the area and were conducting a systematic search to find us. Tommy crawled up beside me and whispered so quietly I could barely hear him, "Mr. Rivera, look at David." I turned to look back at David, and my heart nearly stopped. He was sitting in the bottom of the channel, but his posture was different, more rigid, more alert. His head was tilted to one side like he was listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. And his eyes, when he looked up at me, had that same vacant, hungry expression I had seen in Mrs. Henderson's face just before she attacked. The scratches on his arm were no longer just scratches. They had become something that looked more like bite marks, swollen and discolored, with red streaks radiating outward under his skin. The infection was spreading, and David was starting to change. He hadn't made any aggressive moves yet, but I could see the transformation beginning. His breathing was becoming more shallow and rapid. His fingers were twitching like he was fighting the urge to grab something. Most disturbing of all, he kept looking at the other children with an expression I can only describe as calculating, like he was sizing them up. My grandmother had told me stories about people who got bitten by rabid animals, how they would seem normal for hours or even days before the madness took hold. She said the hardest part was recognizing when someone you cared about was no longer the person you remembered, when compassion became dangerous and tough choices had to be made for the survival of the group. I was facing that choice now. David was 7 years old, a sweet kid who had never hurt anyone in his life. But he was infected, and in a matter of minutes or hours, he was going to become one of those things that had been hunting us. The other children were looking to me for protection, and I was the only adult in a situation where there were no good options. The group of infected above us was getting closer, their moaning sounds echoing off the buildings around the intersection. If David completed his transformation while we were trapped in this channel, he would give away our location, and we would all be caught. But I couldn't bring myself to abandon a 7-year-old child, even if that child was becoming something monstrous. Then David solved the problem for me. He stood up suddenly, his movement jerky and unnatural, and made that moaning sound that I had been dreading. The sound that meant he was no longer David, but one of them. The other children scrambled away from him in terror, pressing themselves against the concrete walls of the channel. But instead of attacking us, he turned and started climbing out of the acequia, moving toward the street level where the other infected were searching. It was like they were calling to him, and he was answering. Within seconds, he had disappeared into the darkness above us, and I could hear his voice joining the chorus of moans that echoed through the intersection. Maria was crying silently, her small body shaking with fear and grief. Tommy was staring at the spot where David had been, his face pale with shock. The other children were looking at me with expressions that mixed terror with accusation, like they were blaming me for not somehow preventing what had just happened. I wanted to explain to them that David was gone, that the thing that had climbed out of the channel wasn't their friend anymore, that there had been nothing I could do to save him. But there wasn't time for explanations or grief. The infected above us were becoming more agitated, their search more intense, and David's transformation had revealed our general location. "We have to move," I whispered urgently. "Right now, as quietly as possible. David is going to lead them away from us, but only if we get out of here before they realize we're still down here." It was a horrible thing to say, using a 7-year-old's transformation into a monster as a tactical advantage. But it was also true. David's appearance had distracted the hunting pack, giving us a window of opportunity to escape while their attention was focused elsewhere. We crawled along the acequia for several hundred yards before I felt safe enough to let the children walk upright again. By then, the sounds of the infected pack were fading behind us, moving in a different direction as they followed David's scent trail away from our actual location. But the encounter had changed something fundamental about our situation. The infection was spreading faster than I had realized, and it could be transmitted through minor scratches, not just bites. Any of us could be infected already, showing no symptoms yet, but carrying the agent that would eventually transform us into predators. More importantly, the infected were becoming more intelligent and coordinated as the day progressed. They were hunting in organized packs, using communication and search patterns that suggested they retained some problem-solving abilities even after losing their humanity. As night fell, they were going to become even more dangerous. I thought about my grandmother's stories of skinwalkers and wendigos, creatures that had once been human but had transformed into something that hunted their former kind. She always said the most dangerous thing about such creatures wasn't their physical power, but their intelligence. They remembered enough about being human to understand human behavior, human weaknesses, human hiding places. Looking at the 6 remaining children, I realized we were no longer just trying to survive until rescue arrived. We were in an evolutionary arms race with creatures that were becoming smarter and more organized every hour. Our only advantages were mobility, daylight, and the traditional wisdom hidden in stories that had been passed down through generations of people who had faced impossible odds and somehow survived to tell about it. The acequia led us to a residential area on the west side of the city, closer to the foothills where the refugee camps were supposed to be located. But it also led us into territory that was completely unfamiliar, where I didn't know the landmarks or the best routes to our destination. As darkness began to fall in earnest, I realized we were going to have to navigate by memory and instinct, using skills I wasn't sure I possessed to keep us alive through what was shaping up to be a very long and dangerous night. The moaning sounds were getting closer again, coming from multiple directions now, and I could see shadows moving between the houses around us. The creatures were closing in, and we were running out of places to hide. The sun disappeared completely behind the Sandia Mountains, and with it went any illusion that we were still living in the same world we had known that morning. As darkness settled over Albuquerque, the infected became something entirely different from what we had encountered during daylight hours. The sluggish, almost dormant creatures we had been able to avoid with careful movement and basic stealth transformed into active predators with what seemed like enhanced senses and coordinated hunting strategies. My grandmother had told me stories about creatures that gained power from darkness, spirits that fed on moonlight and shadow. She called them cazadores nocturnos, night hunters, and said they were most dangerous during the hours between sunset and dawn when the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead became thin. I had always assumed these were metaphorical stories, warnings about the psychological dangers of fear and isolation. But watching the infected move through the residential neighborhood around us, I was starting to think my grandmother's stories might have been more literal than I had understood. The 6 remaining children stayed close to me as we moved through backyards and side streets, trying to put distance between ourselves and the sounds of hunting packs that seemed to be converging on our general area. Maria, Emma, Jake, Louis, Tommy, and Sarah. 6 kids between the ages of 6 and 9, depending on me to get them to safety when I had no idea what I was doing or where we were going. The loss of David had shaken all of us, but it had also taught us something important about how this infection worked. The transformation wasn't immediate. There was an incubation period, maybe a few hours, during which the infected person seemed normal before the change became visible. That meant any of us could be carrying the infection right now, showing no symptoms, but getting closer to transformation with every passing minute. I found myself watching the children for signs of change. Unusual aggression, vacant stares, that telltale moaning sound that seemed to be how the infected communicated with each other. So far, everyone seemed normal, just scared and exhausted, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was waiting for a time bomb to go off. We took shelter behind a row of garbage cans in an alley between 2 houses, trying to catch our breath and figure out our next move. The radio I had taken from the food truck was picking up scattered emergency broadcasts, but the information was fragmented and contradictory. Some stations were reporting that the National Guard had the situation under control. Others were saying that entire cities had gone dark, with no communication from military units that had been sent in to establish quarantine zones. What worried me most was a report I heard from a station in Phoenix. The announcer, speaking in a voice that was barely holding together, said that the infected seemed to be developing new behaviors after prolonged exposure to the contaminating agent. They were learning to use tools, to open doors, to coordinate complex group activities. Some were even retaining enough language ability to mimic human speech, using familiar voices to lure survivors out of hiding. If that was true, then we weren't just dealing with mindless zombies. We were facing creatures that retained enough intelligence to adapt and evolve their hunting strategies. The longer this outbreak continued, the more dangerous they would become. Tommy crawled up beside me and whispered, "Mr. Rivera, I hear something weird." He pointed toward the house directly in front of us, a single-story adobe home with a small front yard and a carport. At first, I didn't hear anything unusual, just the distant moaning sounds that had become the soundtrack of our nightmare. But then I caught it too. Someone was calling for help. A woman's voice, coming from inside the house, pleading for someone to please come and help her, saying that she was trapped and couldn't get out. It sounded genuine, desperate, exactly the kind of situation where decent people would rush to provide assistance. But my grandmother had told me stories about creatures that could mimic human voices, spirits that would call out in the voices of loved ones to lure travelers off safe paths and into dangerous territory. She called them voces falsas, false voices, and said the only way to detect them was to listen not just to the words, but to the rhythm and emotion behind them. The woman's voice was calling for help, but there was something mechanical about it, like she was repeating the same phrases over and over without variation. Real people in genuine distress don't speak in loops. They improvise, they add details, they respond to changing circumstances. This voice sounded more like a recording than a living person. "That's not a real person," I whispered to the children. "Something is trying to trick us into going into that house. We need to stay away from it and keep moving." But even as I said it, I could see the doubt in their faces. They were children, conditioned to help adults in distress, taught that ignoring someone's cries for help was morally wrong. The voice sounded so realistic, so genuinely frightened, that part of me was starting to wonder if I was being overly paranoid. Then the voice changed. Just for a moment, it shifted from the woman's pleading tone to something else entirely. A low, hungry, growling sound, followed by what sounded like multiple voices speaking in unison, all saying the same words at the same time. "Please help me. I'm trapped. Please come help me." The children pressed closer to me, finally understanding that whatever was in that house wasn't human anymore. The infected weren't just becoming more coordinated. They were developing sophisticated deception tactics, using their retained memories of human behavior to set traps for survivors. We moved away from the house as quietly as possible, but the experience had shaken me more than I wanted to admit. If the infected could mimic human speech convincingly enough to fool desperate survivors, how many other capabilities were they developing? Were they learning to use weapons, to drive vehicles, to plan complex ambushes? My grandmother's stories suddenly seemed less like folklore and more like instruction manuals for a kind of warfare I had never imagined. The tale of the clever crow, who survived by studying his enemies until he understood their weaknesses better than they did. The legend of the silent fox, who could move through dangerous territory without being detected because she understood how predators think and hunt. As we moved through the darkened neighborhood, I started applying the lessons from those stories more systematically. The infected seemed to hunt primarily by sound and movement, which meant we needed to minimize both. They were drawn to artificial light, so we avoided streetlights and illuminated buildings. They moved in predictable patterns, following scent trails and investigating areas where they had previously found prey, so we stayed away from main roads and obvious shelter locations. Most importantly, they seemed to operate on some kind of pack mentality that prioritized group coordination over individual initiative. When one of them detected something interesting, it would call the others, but if the initial signal was weak or uncertain, the pack might investigate half-heartedly before moving on to more promising areas. We were using this knowledge to play a deadly game of hide and seek through suburban Albuquerque, staying just ahead of hunting packs while making slow but steady progress toward the foothills. But the game was getting harder with each passing hour. The infected were becoming more numerous, more organized, and more persistent in their searches. We had been moving for about 3 hours after sunset when we encountered something that changed my understanding of what we were dealing with. We were crossing through a small park, staying low and moving from tree to tree for cover, when we saw them. A group of about 20 infected people standing in a rough circle around the park's playground equipment. But they weren't wandering aimlessly or searching for prey. They were just standing there, swaying slightly, making low humming sounds that seemed almost musical. It was like they were having some kind of meeting, or performing a ritual, or engaging in a form of communication that was too complex for me to understand. One of them, a man in what looked like a mechanic's uniform, stepped into the center of the circle and made a series of grunts and gestures that the others seemed to respond to. They started moving in a coordinated pattern, some heading north, others going south, spreading out to cover more territory in what looked like a planned search operation. These weren't mindless zombies driven by pure instinct. They were retaining enough cognitive function to engage in strategic planning and group coordination. They were becoming something new, something that combined human intelligence with predatory instincts and an apparent immunity to normal human emotions like fear or compassion. I guided the children around the park, giving the infected gathering a wide berth, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I had witnessed. If the infected were capable of that level of organization, they would eventually develop tactics specifically designed to hunt survivors like us. They would learn to set up ambushes, to cut off escape routes, to use their superior numbers and coordination to overwhelm small groups of uninfected humans. Sarah, the 8-year-old who had always loved scary stories, tugged on my sleeve and whispered, "Mr. Rivera, what if they're getting smarter because they're eating people's brains?" It was a child's interpretation of zombie mythology, but it made me think about the biological mechanisms that might be driving these behavioral changes. What if the infectious agent wasn't just transforming the infected into predators, but was somehow allowing them to retain and share the knowledge and skills of the people they consumed? Each victim might be adding to a collective intelligence that made the entire infected population more dangerous. My grandmother had told me stories about spirits that could absorb the memories and abilities of the people they possessed, becoming stronger and more cunning with each victim they claimed. She called them ladrones de almas, soul thieves, and said they were among the most dangerous supernatural entities because they learned from every encounter, becoming harder to defeat the longer they remained active. Whether this outbreak was supernatural or biological, the pattern was the same. The infected were evolving, adapting, becoming more effective predators with each passing hour, and we were running out of tricks to stay ahead of them. We found temporary shelter in an abandoned gas station on the edge of the residential area. The building had been thoroughly looted, but the structure was intact, and there was a small office in the back where we could rest without being visible from the street. More importantly, it had a clear view of the approach routes, so we could see anything coming toward us with enough time to escape. The children were exhausted, running on adrenaline and fear, but they were holding together better than I had any right to expect. Tommy had taken on a leadership role among the group, helping to keep the younger ones calm and focused. Maria had stopped crying and was moving with the quiet determination of someone who understood that survival depended on not attracting attention. Even 6-year-old Jake was following instructions without complaint, staying silent when I signaled for quiet and moving quickly when speed was necessary. But I could see the toll this was taking on all of them. They were children, not soldiers, and they had been forced to witness horrors that no young person should ever have to see. David's transformation had been particularly traumatic, and I knew they were all wondering if the same thing was going to happen to them, or to me, or to each other. I tried to address their fears by returning to what I knew best: stories. Traditional tales that contained practical wisdom about surviving in dangerous situations, but told in a way that provided comfort and hope rather than additional fear. My grandmother used to tell me about the long night, I said quietly, gathering the children around me in the small office. It was a time when darkness covered the land for many days, and dangerous creatures came out to hunt the people who lived in the villages. But the people survived because they remembered the old ways, the knowledge that had been passed down through generations of their ancestors. The children listened intently, hungry for any story that might end with the good guys winning and the monsters being defeated. I told them about communities that survived by working together, by using traditional knowledge about reading animal behavior and weather patterns, by staying calm under pressure and making smart decisions even when they were scared. But as I spoke, I was also listening to the sounds outside the gas station. The infected were still out there, moving through the neighborhood in search patterns that were becoming more sophisticated and thorough. I could hear them communicating with each other through that strange humming sound we had observed at the park, coordinating their activities in ways that suggested they were developing their own primitive language. The radio was picking up fewer and fewer emergency broadcasts. Either the stations were going off the air, or we were moving out of range, or the infrastructure that supported emergency communications was breaking down. The last clear signal I had received was from a military frequency, and the message had been brief and ominous. All units be advised, standard containment protocols have failed. The infected are demonstrating adaptive behavior patterns. Recommend immediate evacuation to designated safe zones. Repeat, standard containment protocols have failed. Standard containment protocols. That suggested the military had been dealing with this type of outbreak before, that there were established procedures for biological contamination events that turned people into predators. But if those protocols had failed, it meant this outbreak was beyond anything they had previously encountered. Lewis, who had been quiet for most of the evening, looked up at me with worried eyes. "Mr. Rivera, are we going to make it to the safe place? Are the soldiers going to be able to help us?" I wanted to give him a reassuring answer, but I was starting to doubt whether the refugee camps in the foothills even still existed. If the military's containment efforts had failed, those camps might have been overrun hours ago. We might be walking toward a trap rather than salvation. But I couldn't tell the children that. They needed hope, and they needed to believe that our journey had a purpose and a destination. So I told them what they needed to hear, while privately preparing for the possibility that we were completely on our own. "Yes," I said, "we're going to make it, but we need to be smart and careful, and we need to stick together. The safe place is still out there, but it might take us longer to reach it than we originally thought." Emma raised her hand like she was in a classroom. "What if some of us get sick like David did? What if the scratches and bites make us turn into those things?" It was the question I had been dreading because I didn't have a good answer. We were all potentially infected, all potentially carrying the agent that would eventually transform us into predators. The only thing we could do was monitor each other for signs of change and hope that our limited exposure to the contaminated water wouldn't be enough to trigger a full transformation. "If anyone starts feeling different or thinking different thoughts or having urges that don't feel normal, you tell me immediately," I said. "The infection seems to work slowly at first, which means we might have time to figure out how to help each other if someone does get sick." But even as I said it, I was thinking about the difficult choices we might have to face. If one of the children started to transform, would I be able to do what needed to be done to protect the others? Could I abandon a child, even if that child was becoming a monster? David had solved that problem for me by leaving on his own, but the next time we might not be so fortunate. The sounds outside were getting closer. Multiple groups of infected moving through the area in what seemed like a coordinated sweep. They were learning to hunt systematically, covering territory in overlapping patterns that would make it much harder for survivors to avoid detection. I checked my watch. It was almost midnight, which meant we had been running and hiding for nearly 10 hours. The children were reaching the limits of their endurance, but we couldn't afford to stay in one place much longer. The infected were getting too close, and their search methods were becoming too thorough. "Time to move again," I whispered, helping the children gather their small backpacks and water bottles. "Remember the story of the night travelers, how they moved like shadows and left no traces behind them?" As we prepared to leave the gas station, I heard something that made my blood run cold. One of the infected packs was using what sounded like a child's voice to call out names. "Maria, Tommy, Jake, we know you're out there. Your parents sent us to find you. Come out so we can take you somewhere safe." The voice was perfect, exactly the kind of authority figure that children are taught to trust and obey. If I hadn't witnessed the mechanical repetition of phrases at the house earlier, I might have been tempted to investigate. But now I understood that the infected were developing increasingly sophisticated deception tactics, using their retained memories of human social behavior to exploit our instincts and emotions. The children looked at me with questioning eyes, wondering if this might be legitimate help finally arriving. I shook my head firmly and pointed toward the back exit of the gas station. We needed to get out of there before the searching voices got any closer. As we slipped out into the darkness behind the building, I could hear the infected getting closer to our former hiding place. Their fake child's voice was becoming more urgent, more pleading, more convincing. They were learning that emotional manipulation was more effective than brute force for luring survivors out of concealment. My grandmother's warnings about creatures that could speak with false voices were proving prophetic, but she had also told me how to counter such deceptions. Listen with your heart, not just your ears. Trust your instincts about what feels wrong, even when your rational mind can't explain why. And remember that in times of great danger, the safest assumption is that anything too good to be true probably is. We moved deeper into the night, 6 children and 1 storyteller, staying one step ahead of predators that were becoming smarter and more dangerous with each passing hour. The foothills were still miles away, and dawn was still hours off, and I was starting to understand that our real enemy wasn't just the infected people hunting us through the darkness. Our real enemy was time itself, and the terrible possibility that we might not be able to stay human long enough to reach safety. We had been moving through the darkness for hours when the first hint of dawn began to appear over the Sandia Mountains. The sky was still mostly black, but there was a subtle change in the quality of the darkness that told me sunrise was maybe 2 hours away. More importantly, we had finally reached the edge of the residential area and could see the foothills rising before us in the distance. But between us and those hills was the most dangerous terrain we had encountered yet. Open ground with minimal cover, crossed by major roads that were clogged with abandoned vehicles and probably crawling with infected. Worse, as the sky began to lighten, I could see that the foothills themselves were dotted with fires and strange lights that suggested the refugee camps might not be the safe havens we had been hoping to reach. The children were exhausted beyond anything I had ever seen. Maria could barely keep her eyes open, and Jake was stumbling with every few steps. Tommy was still alert and helping the others, but even he was showing signs of severe fatigue. We needed rest, but we also needed to cover the remaining distance to higher ground before full daylight revealed our position to any infected that might be hunting in the area. My grandmother had told me stories about the importance of timing in dangerous situations. She said there were moments when staying still was the safest choice, and other moments when movement was essential for survival, even if you were tired and scared and wanted nothing more than to hide somewhere safe. The trick was recognizing which kind of moment you were in and acting accordingly. This was clearly a moment for movement. The infected had been becoming more active and organized throughout the night, and I had noticed that they seemed to be converging on our general area. It was almost like they could sense our presence, tracking us through methods I didn't understand. If we stayed in one place much longer, we would be surrounded by hunting packs that were becoming increasingly difficult to evade. "We're going to make one more big push," I told the children, gathering them around me behind an abandoned pickup truck at the edge of a shopping center parking lot. "The safe place is up in those hills, maybe 3 miles from here. It's going to be hard, but once we get there, we can rest and find help." Emma looked up at me with those serious 8-year-old eyes that had seen too much in the past day. "Mr. Rivera, what if there isn't really a safe place? What if the radio was wrong and there's no one there to help us?" It was a question that had been haunting me for hours. The emergency broadcasts had become increasingly sporadic and contradictory as the night progressed. The last clear signal I had received mentioned that several refugee camps had been evacuated due to security breaches, which was a euphemistic way of saying they had been overrun by infected. But I couldn't give the children that information because they needed hope to keep going. "Even if the camps aren't there anymore, the hills will still be safer than staying down here," I said. "Higher ground means better visibility, cleaner water sources, and fewer places for the infected to hide. My grandmother always said that when everything goes wrong, head for the high places and figure out your next move from there." As we prepared to cross the open ground toward the foothills, I heard something that made me reconsider our entire plan. Helicopter rotors coming from the direction we had been traveling. Military aircraft flying low and fast, heading away from the mountains and toward the city. They weren't heading toward the refugee camps. They were leaving them. The helicopters passed directly overhead, close enough that I could see they were packed with people and equipment. Evacuation flights, not reinforcement missions. Whatever had been happening in the foothills, the military was pulling out rather than trying to hold their positions. But we were already committed to this course of action. Going back into the city would mean navigating through areas that were now completely controlled by infected hunting packs. Our only choice was to continue toward the mountains and hope we could find some kind of shelter in the wilderness areas beyond the abandoned camps. The open ground between us and the foothills was a patchwork of strip malls, gas stations, and fast food restaurants, all connected by wide roads that offered minimal concealment. But it was also crisscrossed by drainage ditches and concrete channels that could provide covered routes for most of our journey. The infrastructure that had been built to manage flash floods and irrigation water was going to serve as our highway to safety. We dropped down into the largest drainage channel and started moving toward the mountains. The concrete walls were about 6 feet high, which meant we were completely hidden from observation at ground level. but we were also trapped in a narrow corridor with limited escape routes if we encountered infected that had fallen or been pushed into the channel system. The children moved in single file behind me, following the lessons we had learned during our escape from the library and our journey through the residential neighborhoods. Stay quiet, stay together, stop when I signal for silence, move quickly when speed is necessary. They had become remarkably skilled at this deadly game of hide and seek, adapting to survive in ways that no children should ever have to learn. But as we moved through the drainage system, I started noticing signs that we weren't the only ones using these channels for concealment. Footprints in the mud, discarded food containers, makeshift campsites where other survivors had rested during their own journeys toward the foothills. Some of the signs were recent, maybe hours old, which meant there were other people moving through the area at the same time we were. That should have been encouraging news, evidence that we weren't alone, and that other survivors had successfully reached this far in their escape from the city. But something about the tracks and campsites bothered me. They were too organized, too systematic, like they had been made by people who were conducting military-style operations rather than desperate families fleeing for their lives. My grandmother had warned me about situations where other survivors could be as dangerous as the original threat. She told me stories about times when communities broke down under pressure, when fear and desperation turned neighbors into enemies, when the struggle for resources led to violence between groups that should have been helping each other. I decided to be extra cautious about contact with other survivors, at least until I could assess their intentions and capabilities. 6 children and 1 adult would be vulnerable to any group that had decided to take supplies or shelter by force rather than trying to find their own. We had been traveling through the drainage system for about an hour when we encountered evidence that my caution was justified. A section of the concrete channel was blocked by what looked like a deliberate barricade, constructed from shopping carts, metal debris, and concrete blocks. But this wasn't a defensive position built by survivors trying to keep infected out. It was designed to channel people toward a specific choke point where they could be observed and potentially intercepted. Fresh footprints around the barricade suggested it was actively monitored, and I could see sight lines that would allow watchers to observe anyone approaching from either direction. Someone was using the drainage system as a trap, waiting for other survivors to come through so they could be robbed, captured, or worse. I gathered the children around me and explained the situation in whispers. We needed to get out of the drainage channel and find another route to the foothills, even if it meant exposing ourselves to observation from infected hunting packs. The risk of encountering hostile survivors was now greater than the risk of being spotted by the creatures that had been chasing us through the night. We climbed out of the channel behind a defunct auto repair shop and found ourselves in an industrial area that offered better concealment than the open ground we had been trying to avoid. Warehouses, storage facilities, and abandoned factories provided multiple hiding places and several different routes toward our destination. But the industrial area also showed signs of recent occupation by groups that weren't necessarily friendly to other survivors. Some buildings had been fortified with makeshift barriers and guard posts. Others showed evidence of having been systematically looted, with valuable supplies removed and anything that couldn't be carried destroyed to prevent other people from using it. Most disturbing were the signs that some groups were actively hunting other survivors. I found spent ammunition casings, bloodstains that were too fresh to be from the initial outbreak, and crude warning messages spray-painted on walls that threatened violence against anyone who entered territory claimed by various self-appointed militias. The breakdown of civilization was happening faster than I had imagined possible. Within less than 24 hours of the initial outbreak, organized groups were already establishing territorial control and treating other survivors as enemies rather than potential allies. The infected weren't the only predators we needed to worry about. Tommy noticed the tension in my posture and the way I was constantly checking for threats from multiple directions. Mr. Rivera, Are there bad people out here too? People who aren't sick but still want to hurt us? I wanted to shield him from that knowledge, but he was smart enough to figure it out anyway, and it was better for all of them to understand the full scope of the dangers we faced. Yes, I said quietly. Some people react to scary situations by trying to take control through force. They think if they can gather enough weapons and supplies, they'll be safe, even if it means hurting other people to get what they want. Sarah, who had always been the bravest of the children, clenched her small fists. That's not fair. We're all just trying to survive. Why can't everyone work together? It was a question that philosophers and sociologists had been debating for centuries, but I tried to give her an answer that an 8-year-old could understand. Fear makes some people selfish, I said. They stop thinking about what's right and wrong, and they only think about what they need to do to feel safe. But other people, like all of you, react to fear by being braver and kinder, and more helpful than usual. As we moved through the industrial area, staying in the shadows and avoiding the buildings that showed signs of occupation, I started thinking about my grandmother's stories of community survival during times of crisis. She had told me about the influenza pandemic of 1918, when entire families died within days and children were left orphaned with no one to care for them. Some communities responded by turning inward, protecting only their own and driving away outsiders who might bring additional problems. But other communities responded by expanding their definition of family, taking in orphaned children, sharing scarce resources, and working together to solve problems that no individual family could handle alone. The communities that chose cooperation and mutual aid were more likely to survive intact, while the ones that chose isolation and competition often destroyed themselves fighting over resources that could have been shared. The challenge was identifying which type of community we might encounter if we found other survivors in the foothills. Were we likely to meet people who would welcome 6 children and offer assistance, or people who would see us as competitors for limited supplies and try to drive us away? My grandmother's advice for such situations was simple but difficult to implement. Approach with caution, observe before making contact, be prepared to help others if possible, but never sacrifice your own group's safety for the sake of strangers who might not reciprocate your generosity. We were perhaps a mile from the base of the foothills when we encountered our first test of that philosophy. Moving between 2 warehouse buildings, we came across a family that was obviously in serious trouble. A man, a woman, and 2 small children, all of them injured and exhausted, hiding behind a loading dock while a group of infected searched the area around them. The family had apparently been trying to reach the refugee camps when they were attacked by one of the hunting packs. The man had a serious bite wound on his leg that was bleeding heavily, and one of the children appeared to have a broken arm. They were trapped, unable to move quickly enough to escape the infected that were closing in on their position. Every instinct I had developed as a storyteller and a human being told me to help them. These were people in desperate need, and I had 6 children with me who were watching to see what kind of man I was, what kind of moral example I would set when faced with other people's suffering. But I also had a responsibility to keep my own group safe, and approaching that family would mean exposing all of us to the hunting pack that was searching for them. The infected had already demonstrated that they could track by scent and sound, so any rescue attempt would likely attract their attention to our location. More troubling was the obvious bite wound on the man's leg. Based on what we had learned from David's transformation, that man was probably infected and would begin changing within hours. Helping his family might mean bringing an infected person into close contact with my children, risking their lives for people who might not survive anyway. I made the hardest decision of my life up to that point. I signaled for my children to stay hidden and quiet while I watched the situation develop, hoping that the family would find a way to escape on their own, but not actively intervening in a situation that would endanger the lives that had been entrusted to my care. The infected found them within minutes. The family's screams lasted only briefly before being replaced by the feeding sounds that had become the soundtrack of our nightmare. I held my hand over Maria's mouth to prevent her from crying out, and I watched Tommy struggle with the realization that sometimes survival meant making choices that felt morally wrong. But the encounter taught us something important about how the infected operated in larger groups. After they finished with the family, they didn't disperse randomly. They formed up into a rough formation and started moving in a coordinated pattern toward the foothills, following what appeared to be a predetermined search route. They weren't just hunting individuals anymore. They were conducting systematic sweeps of territory, moving through areas in organized formations that would make it almost impossible for survivors to avoid detection. The intelligence that we had observed during the night was continuing to evolve, and the infected were developing military-style tactics for finding and eliminating the remaining uninfected population. That meant the foothills, which we had been counting on as our destination and refuge, were probably being systematically searched by coordinated hunting parties. The refugee camps had been evacuated not just because they were overrun, but because the entire area was no longer defensible against enemies that could think strategically and coordinate complex operations. I started revising our plans in real time, thinking about alternative destinations that might offer better prospects for long-term survival. The wilderness areas beyond the foothills, places where the infected would have difficulty moving in large groups, and where natural barriers might provide defensible positions for small groups of survivors. But first, we had to cross the remaining open ground to the base of the mountains, and we had to do it while avoiding both the infected hunting parties and the human groups that were treating other survivors as enemies. The sun was getting higher, which would make concealment more difficult, but it would also make the infected less active and focused. My grandmother had told me stories about dawn being the time of greatest hope and greatest danger, when the creatures of darkness became weaker, but the survivors were most likely to make mistakes due to exhaustion and the false sense of security that came with daylight. As we prepared to make our final approach to the foothills, I realized that we were entering the most dangerous phase of our journey. Not because the destination was particularly hazardous, but because after nearly 24 hours of constant fear and adrenaline, we were all running on empty. The children were at the limits of their physical and emotional endurance, and I was making decisions based on fatigue and stress rather than clear thinking. That was when mistakes happened, when people who had survived impossible odds finally made the one error that proved fatal. My grandmother's stories were full of heroes who succeeded through 99 challenges only to fail at the 100th, because they let their guard down at the wrong moment. I gathered the children around me one more time, making sure I could see all of their faces clearly. Maria, Emma, Jake, Louis, Tommy, and Sarah. 6 kids who had shown incredible courage and resilience over the past day, who deserved to survive and grow up and have normal lives again. This is the hardest part, I told them honestly. We're tired, we're scared, and we want this to be over. But that's exactly when we need to be most careful, most alert, most committed to helping each other. The stories always say that the heroes face their greatest test right before they reach safety. Louis looked toward the mountains and asked the question I had been dreading. What if we get up there and there's no one to help us? What if we're all alone and we have to take care of ourselves? It was a possibility I had been trying not to think about, but it was also the most likely outcome based on everything we had observed and heard during our journey. The refugee camps were gone, the military was evacuating, and the infrastructure of civilization was breaking down faster than anyone had anticipated. Then we'll figure out how to take care of ourselves, I said, trying to project more confidence than I felt. People have survived in the wilderness for thousands of years using knowledge that's been passed down through stories and traditional wisdom. We'll find water, we'll find shelter, and we'll find a way to signal for help when help becomes available again. As we started our final approach to the mountains, moving from cover to cover across increasingly open terrain, I could see smoke rising from multiple locations in the foothills. Some of it was probably from the evacuated refugee camps, but other fires suggested ongoing conflicts between different groups of survivors, or systematic destruction of resources to prevent them from being used by others. The radio had been silent for hours, no longer picking up any emergency broadcasts or military communications. Either we were out of range of active transmitters, or the communications infrastructure had been destroyed, or there simply wasn't anyone left with the authority and equipment to coordinate rescue operations. Whatever was waiting for us in the mountains, we were going to face it alone, with nothing but the traditional wisdom contained in stories that most people had dismissed as obsolete folklore. My grandmother's teachings about survival, community, and the importance of maintaining hope even in the darkest circumstances were about to be tested under conditions she had probably never imagined. But as I watched the 6 children following my lead across dangerous ground, showing courage and determination that would have impressed warriors and heroes from any of the traditional stories, I started to believe that maybe those old teachings were exactly what we needed to survive in a world that had suddenly become very old and very dangerous. The sun was rising behind us, and ahead lay the unknown challenges of the high country, and somewhere beyond that, the possibility of finding other survivors who still believed in cooperation and mutual aid rather than competition and conflict. We were almost to the base of the mountains when I heard the sound that would change everything about our situation. The sound I heard was a radio transmission, crackling through the small emergency radio I had been carrying since we left the food truck. But it wasn't coming from any official emergency broadcast station. This was a civilian frequency, and the voice speaking was calm, organized, and deliberately transmitting information for survivors who might be listening. This is Tower Base to any survivors in the Albuquerque area. We have established a secure position at the radio transmission facility on Sandia Crest. We have clean water, medical supplies, and defensive positions. If you can reach the base of the mountain road, follow the service trail markers to elevation 7,000 feet. Look for the red and white transmission towers. We monitor this frequency continuously. Tower Base out. The children gathered around me as I adjusted the radio's antenna, trying to get a clearer signal. The transmission repeated every few minutes, automated but recent enough that someone was actively maintaining the equipment. More importantly, it was coming from a location I could see, high up on the mountainside where a cluster of radio towers had been built decades ago to serve the Albuquerque metropolitan area. Tower Base. It sounded official, military, exactly the kind of organized rescue operation we had been hoping to find. But my grandmother had always warned me about being too eager to trust strangers during dangerous times, especially when those strangers seemed to have exactly what you needed most desperately. Could be a trap, I said quietly, as much to myself as to the children. People who want to lure survivors to a specific location where they can be robbed or worse. But Tommy pointed out something I had missed. Mr. Rivera, if they wanted to hurt people, why would they tell them to bring medical supplies and mention defensive positions? Wouldn't they try to make it sound easier and safer? He was right. The transmission included details that suggested genuine preparation for helping survivors, not the kind of false promises that would be used to lure victims into an ambush. Medical supplies, clean water, defensive positions, these were things that survivors actually needed, not the simple promises of safety that would appeal to desperate people. More convincing was the location itself. The radio towers on Sandia Crest were built on naturally defensible terrain at high elevation, with multiple escape routes and clear lines of sight in all directions. It was exactly where I would have tried to establish a base if I had the resources and manpower to create a secure position for other survivors. The transmission also explained the helicopters we had seen evacuating the foothills earlier. They hadn't been abandoning the area completely. They had been consolidating their positions at locations, that could be defended more effectively against the coordinated hunting tactics the infected had been developing. I made the decision to attempt contact with Tower Base, but I was going to be extremely careful about how we approached them. My grandmother's stories were full of warnings about the importance of observing strangers before revealing yourself to them, of learning their true intentions before putting yourself at their mercy. "We're going to try to reach these people," I told the children, "but we're going to do it smart. We observe them first, we make sure they're really trying to help survivors, and we don't let them know we're coming until we're sure it's safe." The climb to 7,000 feet elevation would take several hours, even if we used the service road rather than trying to navigate cross-country through difficult terrain. But the radio transmission had mentioned trail markers, which suggested that other survivors had already made this journey successfully, and that the route was established and maintained. We started climbing through the foothills as the sun rose higher, following a dirt service road that had been cut into the mountainside to provide access to the various communication installations scattered throughout the area. The road was steep and winding, but it was clearly marked and offered much better concealment than the open ground we had been crossing during the night. More importantly, we encountered signs that other survivors had passed this way recently. Footprints, discarded water bottles, even some crude arrows scratched into rocks to indicate the correct direction for people who might be traveling at night or in poor visibility. Someone was actively maintaining this route as an escape corridor for survivors fleeing the infected zones below. But as we climbed higher, I started noticing other signs that made me more cautious. Observation posts carved into the rocks, positions that would allow watchers to monitor the approach road without being seen by people traveling toward the summit. Fresh tire tracks from vehicles that had been moving supplies up and down the mountain. Evidence of recent construction and fortification work around the radio installation. Tower Base wasn't just a refugee camp. It was a military installation, complete with defensive positions, supply lines, and systematic observation of anyone approaching their perimeter. That could be good news, evidence of organized leadership and adequate resources for long-term survival. But it could also mean that they had strict policies about who they would accept and what they would require from survivors in exchange for protection. The children were struggling with the altitude and the steep grade of the service road. We were now above 6,000 feet elevation, and the thin air was making everyone breathe harder and move more slowly. But we were also far above the elevation where the infected seemed to operate effectively. The hunting packs we had encountered during the night appeared to be concentrated in the valley areas where most of the human population lived. That made sense from a biological perspective. If the infection was spread through contaminated water sources, it would be most concentrated in areas with high population density and shared infrastructure. The mountainous areas, which relied on different water sources and had much lower population density, might be naturally resistant to the spread of the contaminating agent. My grandmother had told me stories about times when people retreated to the high country during plagues and disasters, using elevation and isolation as protection against contamination that affected the lowland communities. She said the mountains had always been places of refuge, where small groups could survive independently while waiting for dangerous conditions to pass. We were about a mile from the radio towers when we encountered our first checkpoint. Two people in military-style clothing, armed with rifles, positioned behind a defensive barricade that blocked the service road. They were obviously watching our approach, but they didn't seem hostile or threatening. Professional, alert, but not aggressive. I signaled for the children to stay behind me and walked forward with my hands visible, carrying the radio so they could see that we had been listening to their transmissions. "Are you Tower Base?" I called out when I was close enough to speak without shouting. "We are," replied one of the guards, a woman in her 30s with the bearing of someone accustomed to command authority. "How many in your group, and are any of you showing symptoms of infection?" "7 total, 6 children and myself. No symptoms that we've observed, but we had limited exposure to contaminated water yesterday afternoon. One child in our original group was infected and transformed, but that was hours ago, and he's no longer with us. The guards exchanged glances, communicating through subtle gestures that suggested they had dealt with similar situations before. Any bites or scratches from infected individuals? I thought about David's scratches, which had led to his transformation, and realized I needed to be completely honest about potential exposure risks. One child had scratches that appeared to be from infected contact, but he transformed and left our group during the night. The rest of us have been monitoring each other for symptoms since then. What's your background? Military, medical, technical skills that might be useful for community defense. It was an interesting question, suggesting that Tower Base was evaluating potential new arrivals based on their ability to contribute to group survival, rather than just providing humanitarian assistance to anyone who needed help. I'm a storyteller and cultural preservationist, I said. I specialize in traditional knowledge and oral history, including survival techniques from various indigenous cultures. I've been using that knowledge to keep this group alive during our journey from the city. The second guard, a man in his 40s with the weathered appearance of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors, looked skeptical. Storyteller. That's not exactly a survival skill. But the woman was more thoughtful. Actually, it might be. We've been struggling with morale and group cohesion as more survivors arrive and resources get stretched. Someone who can help maintain community spirit and preserve cultural knowledge could be valuable for long-term sustainability. They had a brief conversation through hand signals and radio communication with someone at the base installation, then turned back to us with a decision. You can proceed to Tower Base for evaluation and temporary shelter. Follow the red trail markers and don't deviate from the marked route. The area around the installation is monitored and defended, so any movement outside designated areas will be considered potentially hostile. As we continued climbing toward the radio towers, now visible on the ridge above us, I reflected on what that checkpoint encounter had revealed about the community we were hoping to join. They were organized, professional, and clearly thinking strategically about long-term survival rather than just short-term refugee assistance. But they were also selective about who they accepted, evaluating people based on their potential contributions rather than just their need for help. That suggested they were operating with limited resources and couldn't afford to support anyone who couldn't help support the community in return. More concerning was their emphasis on monitoring and controlling movement within their territory. That could be necessary security in a dangerous environment, but it could also indicate an authoritarian leadership structure that might not welcome questions or alternative approaches to survival. The final approach to Tower Base revealed a community that was much more substantial than I had expected. The radio installation had been expanded into a fortified compound with multiple buildings, defensive barriers, solar power systems, water purification equipment, and what appeared to be agricultural areas for food production. There were perhaps 50 people visible, adults and children, all engaged in various activities related to maintaining and expanding their survival infrastructure. Gardens, workshops, communication centers, medical facilities, even what looked like a school area where children were being taught by adult volunteers. But I also noticed armed guards at strategic positions, strict protocols for entering and leaving different areas of the compound, and evidence that decision-making was centralized under clear military-style command authority. This wasn't a democratic refugee camp. It was an organized survival community with disciplined leadership and well-defined roles for everyone. A man in his 50s, wearing clean clothes and speaking with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, approached our group as we reached the main gate. "I'm Colonel Martinez, and I run this operation. We've been expecting you since the checkpoint radioed ahead. Before we can integrate you into our community, I need to understand your situation and your capabilities." I introduced myself and the children, explaining our journey from the library in Albuquerque and the experiences that had taught us about infected behavior and survival techniques in urban environments. Colonel Martinez listened carefully, asking specific questions about the coordinated hunting tactics we had observed and the evidence of continued intelligence in the infected population. That matches what our scouts have been reporting from other areas, he said. The infected are evolving rapidly, developing organizational capabilities that make traditional containment strategies ineffective. We're not just dealing with a biological contamination anymore. We're facing an enemy that can think strategically and adapt to countermeasures. He explained that Tower Base had been established as a research and coordination center for understanding the infection and developing effective responses to it. They had scientists, military personnel, and civilian specialists working together to study the contaminating agent and find ways to neutralize or reverse its effects. Your storytelling background might be more relevant than you realize, Colonel Martinez continued. We've found that traditional ecological knowledge often contains information about historical disease outbreaks and the techniques communities use to survive them. Indigenous stories and folklore sometimes preserve practical wisdom that modern science has overlooked. That was exactly what my grandmother had always insisted, that traditional stories weren't just entertainment, but contained survival information disguised as narrative. The possibility that my cultural knowledge might actually be valuable for fighting this infection was something I hadn't expected. But Colonel Martinez also explained the conditions for remaining at Tower Base. Everyone was expected to contribute to community defense and survival activities. Resources were allocated based on contribution levels and essential needs. Decisions about community policies were made by the Leadership Council, not through democratic voting processes. We're not running a charity operation, he said bluntly. We're building a survival community that can outlast this crisis and eventually help rebuild civilization. Everyone here has a job, everyone follows the rules, and everyone understands that individual desires are subordinated to community survival needs. It wasn't the kind of refuge I had been hoping to find, but it was clearly the most organized and well-resourced survival community in the area. The children would have safety, medical care, education, and the company of other survivors their age. I would have the opportunity to contribute my knowledge while learning new skills that might help us survive if we ever had to leave this community. As I considered Colonel Martinez's offer, I realized that our 24-hour journey from the library to this mountain installation had been more than just an escape from immediate danger. It had been a transformation from refugees fleeing a crisis to potential members of a new kind of community, one specifically designed to survive and thrive in a world that had been fundamentally changed by the events of the past day. The stories I had collected about historical plagues and community survival were about to become practical resources for people facing similar challenges in real time. My grandmother's teachings about the importance of traditional knowledge and cultural preservation were proving their value under conditions she probably never imagined, but had somehow prepared me for through the wisdom embedded in folklore and oral tradition. Tower Base represented safety and resources, but it also represented the future. Not just our immediate survival, but the possibility of preserving and rebuilding human civilization using both modern technology and traditional wisdom that had sustained communities through previous disasters. As I looked at the 6 children who had trusted me to guide them through the darkest night of their lives, I understood that our story was far from over. The first 24 hours of the zombie outbreak had taught us that survival required more than just avoiding immediate threats. It required building new kinds of communities, preserving essential knowledge, and adapting traditional wisdom to unprecedented challenges. The radio tower on the mountain peak above us was still broadcasting its automated message to any survivors who might be listening, offering hope and practical assistance to people who had the courage and determination to make the dangerous journey to safety. But it was also transmitting something more important: the message that human civilization wasn't ending, just transforming, and that stories and traditional knowledge would play a crucial role in determining what kind of world we would build from the ruins of the old one. I accepted Colonel Martinez's offer, and 6 children who had started the day as library patrons listening to folklore became members of a survival community that would need both their resilience and my storytelling abilities to face whatever challenges the coming days would bring.